Hello, friends. Welcome to Logistics of Logistics Podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is Beyond the Rails and Roads, the State of Intermodal with my friend Ann Reinke. How's it going, Ann?
Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
I'm excited to talk to you again. Ann, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Sure. I'm in Calverton, Maryland. That's just outside of the Beltway in case we have some DC, Maryland, Virginia natives, and they know what that means. I am calling you from IANA, the Intermodal Association of North America. It is a 34-year-old organization representing the interests of the intermodal industry. So who might that be? We have ocean-going vessels. We have drayage carriers. We have Class 1 and short-line railroads. And we have various equipment providers and suppliers and BCOs. We have over 1,000 members.
Wow. So, Ann, many people will probably listen to this before, heard me interview you when you were at TIA. So you were relatively new to IANA. When and why did you join?
Yes, I started in December, so I'm really seasoned. I've got 4 months under my belt, so I know everything that there is to know. I was at TIA for 4 years, and I was not looking to depart. But I got approached just to have an interview, and I really thought, to tell you the truth, I really thought that they were just doing it to be nice and just make sure they're doing all their due diligence. And I didn't think that my predecessor really was going to retire. I thought that they had an heir apparent, all this stuff. Anyway, they ended up approaching me and asking me to come over here. And as you know, Joe, as we've talked, I worked in the railroad industry for years and years and years. And so there's this sentimental attachment I have to railroads, I suppose. So now I've come back and I interact with the Class 1 railroads. They're on my board. And so perhaps it's a little bit like coming home.
Yeah, that's nice. And it's funny because I think TIA is very well known in the transportation logistics business. I feel like IANA is not nearly as well known. And I know you're going out to change that.
That's right. And so, yeah, TIA, because it's the only organization representing the freight brokerage industry, it really has a distinct identity, a role to play. I mean, they're hustling out there representing the freight brokers. So IANA it's interesting because it's representing a business line, if you will, a corner of the economy. But the industries that are represented are also represented by their own associations. And so it has this kind of sweet spot that we are interested in, the interaction between multi-modes. So we have a lot of partners, but we don't have necessarily everyone who's represented just caring about everything that's part of that mode, if that makes sense. So we really have to straddle that line. They hired me because they know that we have a profoundly important role to play, but as you mentioned, not very well known. Known amongst those who perhaps do intermodal, but not as well as they should be.
Yes, and I think we'll get into some of the details of what intermodal is, and the reason and you mentioned BCOs and the short line railroads. This is a world that is all around us, and I always say this. You're driving in your car and you go, where the hell does that railroad track go to? I know it's going to nowhere. Those are those short line railroads that are critically important. They aren't particularly well known, and containerized freight, and the people who do it know it really well, the freight forwarders, but I feel like it's compared to trucking or freight brokerage, the whole intermodal space is a little bit of a hidden gem in our economy. No one knows it's there, but everything, the chair you're sitting in, the chair I sit at, the desk I'm at, probably all came in a box.
100%. Yes. And when the supply chain dysfunction and the port crisis of 2021, our members were desperately trying to make it work. And the ones that were most profoundly affected, because America has a lot of consumer goods that come in containers. That's how they come, by and large. They come in containers.
Yep, it is. We'll talk more about that. By the way, I actually wrote it down. I've referenced this book that I never remember the title other than The Box, how the shipping container made the world smaller and the world economy bigger. Anne's holding it up for those watching on video. It is an excellent book. I listened to it. And basically it talks about before we had intermodal freight, which is basically late 50s, 60s, and they got really popular during, I think, Vietnam. Um, it all of a sudden became intermodal, and world trade became economical, because before that, unloading the boat and loading the boat was so expensive and so much damage and so much loss that you're like, we can't do it. We're not going to ship anything. And when we started with those boxes, you can unload those boxes out with the cranes and load very quickly, unload very, very quickly too. It changed the world. Anyway, and tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you joined IANA.
So I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, and this is where I start wanting to talk about the Redskins, now the Commanders, most of the time, because, and I won't spend too much time on it, but anyone who lives in this area knows that it has been 30 years of mediocrity. And there used to be triumph, and it was such a way to bring the city together. And I'm old enough to know those days. And so now the season that we just had, Joe, has been a way to renew our faith and a way to feel good. I mean, politics is terrible at any time, but certainly this time no different. And so to have something to believe in that gives you joy is really tremendous. All right, so there, I've said it. I'm not going to talk
Well,
about
wait, and I have to stop you right there, because you act as if 30 years of bad record somehow matters to a Detroiter. we we have not had, until recently, we have not had anything. Everyone in Detroit for years would say, "Oh, who's your team? Your playoff team?" We knew you were talking about who your playoff team. So Washington was one of my playoff teams back, I'm thinking, in the 70s, John Riggins and all those. I love those guys. Pittsburgh was one of my, I love Mean Joe Green and all those guys. Patriots for years, and Tom Brady, they were my playoff team. We have never been in a Super Bowl.
I know. I'm
By the
sorry.
way, I got to tell you, this is how bad it was. When I was a little kid, my parents bought a house, and it was the Lions football coach. He was moving. I think he moved to Miami. And when he gave me like a dozen footballs, actual Detroit Lions footballs. Me and my friends played with them. We thought we were half Lions, right? And then I played on the Dearborn line. So I grew up loving the Lions. And then I just faded away. It's just like floated away. Anyway.
Well,
So
but now you got a great coach. You got a
yeah. We
great
love it now.
quarterback. And I will say the Commanders did beat the Lions in the playoffs,
Mm-hmm.
which I know hurt, although we felt jubilant. Anyway.
Yeah, we didn't expect to lose. I think that was, we had so many injuries by the end, but yeah, it's just nice to be part of the mix. Like, say, we could win.
We've been irrelevant for so long. So,
I know.
anyway,
Everybody deserves their day in the sun.
Everybody does.
So getting back to it, beyond your football upbringing, what was your where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you joined TIA and IANA.
I went to Rice University in Houston, Texas. Sorry about University of Houston losing last night. I really was kind of pulling for them. That was a tough one. We were in the Southwest Conference when I went, so we used to routinely lose to Texas and Texas A&M and Texas Tech. Now Rice is part of a different, smaller conference, and I think they still lose to a lot of teams, but that's okay. We have a good baseball team. Then I went to law school at Wake Forest in North Carolina, and I came back to DC. I got into lobbying because I did not feel like being a lawyer. The law firm job I first had was doing work of a trained monkey. I just couldn't get behind it. Lobbying is sort of like advocacy, right? It is. It's just a different kind. And so I really enjoyed that. And working for CSX for as long as I did, 16 years.
That's the railroad company, CSX.
That's the railroad. It was never boring. Sometimes dramatic, but never, ever dull. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it until I didn't. And then I got an opportunity to work at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where I was an appointed position. I did congressional affairs, intergovernmental affairs, and what a education. It got me out of my specific mode of railroads because I got exposed to all the different modes. And that's how TIA found me, because I was at this position where I had kind of a world view of trucks and, ships and trains and all of it, as opposed to just trains. Had I not been at USDOT, I would never had that TIA job. And if I had never had that TIA job, I never would be here at IANA.
So tell me, I've not talked to anybody from the Department of Transportation. What is its role? So I know there's at the ports, there's the Federal Maritime Commission on the ports, and then there's the DOT that goes right to the ports, or does it overlap?
Yeah, so it's interesting. DOT has different administrative agencies that take up for the different modes. So DOT in this particular case has MARAD, and MARAD, which is the Maritime Administration, does a lot of the kind of, they regulate the service academies, right? So like the Coast Guard Academy and the Merchant Marine Academy and that kind of thing. And they also then provide port grants for the various ports, whereas the FMC, Federal Maritime Commission, really is looking at kind of the business transactions, the business of the port, and the MARAD's really more about the safety and the growth of the port, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what is the DOT's mission beyond the ports?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, DOT's mission is typically safety, the safety of the various modes. It has become, over the years, because of congressional delegation, one of the largest grant-making authorities as well. So the safety of the highways, right? The safety of the railroads, the safety of the skies, most critically recently. That is a huge mission of the Department of Transportation, because you have this is all interstate commerce. You have to have this larger regulatory body that has expertise and specializes in the safety and provides that infrastructure, right? But because Congress has over the years decided they don't want to be in the business of doing its job. Sorry, that's like a biting remark here, but of appropriating money to projects, they have provided these enormous grant programs. So the FRA has CRISI, for example, and the DOT writ large has
Wait, what is the FRA?
The FRA is the Federal Railroad Administration. So they're in charge of safety, of course, but now they also have an opportunity to give grants to various, groups across the United States who would like a grade crossing removed, or they would like a overpass over a road, or that kind of stuff. So they still do safety as they should, and then now they're doing a lot of grants.
So do they get involved with the highways and saying, hey, here's a grant for highways?
Yeah. So this, now we're getting really weedy, but the gas tax funds the Federal Highway Administration, and that money goes into FHWA for them then to administer and allot to the various states. As you may know, the gas tax, because cars have become more efficient, and because the gas tax hasn't been raised since 1992, it does not cover the actual demand on the roads. And so what typically happens is Congress then has to supplement with general funds for various additional needs.
It's interesting. When you go back in our history a little bit, when we had this big expressway and highway programs in the 60s and 70s, it connected the United States and made it into one cohesive market. Because there was a time where business was much more regional. Even when I was a kid, like you'd have Stroh's beer was local here to Detroit, and Miller was a Milwaukee thing. Everyone had their own, their own potato chips, their own beer company, own soaps even. And then we started consolidating and going national at a certain point because the cost of trucking and the cost of distribution was different. Even I was talking to my mom. My mom moved from the coal mines in Pennsylvania to Detroit during the war. And I remember she said, oh, yeah, you'd have to take the train. I mean, I guess you could take a car. She goes, but it wasn't like there was expressways here. It'd be like driving on surface streets. I mean, Pennsylvania is like, 6 hours from here, 5 hours from here. And I was like, take a You take a train? She's like, yeah, like there's no planes to take. Like it's like a rich person thing then. And I was like, that's crazy.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, the whole transportation infrastructure has been completely revamped since our parents were kids, right?
Yeah. It's, by the way, the Southwest, like Arizona and parts of Texas, they weren't connected to the United States. If somebody said, yeah, I want to drive to Texas, you're going to be driving on some of those gray roads. You're going to be driving on roads where you're like, this is like you're going like the old fashioned, like two way streets.
Yeah. I
So
mean, they have roads that are called like FR 1718 or whatever, like farm road, right? Like that's what it was. It's,
well, that's even if you hear people talk about Route 66, that's famous. Well, no one takes it anymore because it's a two way street. But anyway, I think when it works right, the infrastructure programs are the backbone of our economy, the backbone of our whole industry. Um, I think we tend to focus. I know I tend to focus on the negatives of what Washington brings, but when it works, it really works. So let's talk. Uh, I want to talk about a few things, but first off, let's just talk about the basics of intermodal because I don't think everybody is uh, does that every day. I think we're all touched by it, but we don't understand it. So the intermodal is those big boxes, the shipping boxes, and
yeah, it's the containers. That's exactly right.
I know I've asked this other people, but I'll ask you: the shipping containers. Who owns those shipping containers? Is it always the shipping companies, the big boat companies?
Yeah, typically it's the steamship lines that own those containers.
So more and more of those boxes have technology in them, cameras, sensors, so we can see if it's cold. If we can see, I saw recently somebody said there's sensors that can detect if there's humans in those containers, and sensors that can detect if there's fentanyl in those containers. So I think the shipping companies, are they going to be the ones to upgrade all these containers to this stuff when we want that, or are there separate companies? Like I think there's leasing companies that also own those boxes. I don't know how deep you've gotten into the weeds on this.
Not deeply enough, but yeah, I mean, the part of the conversation, Joe, that you and I had when I was with TIA is a couple of things. One is the expectation of timeliness. It's critical to a lot of our retailers, of the people on the end who are receiving the containers. So there is a recognition that they want timeliness and an understanding and appreciation of when the container is arriving. Not just the dray carrier who's supposed to receive it from the vessel that lands at the port, and then the dray picks it up and the dray takes it to a warehouse or to a rail yard and where the railroad takes it. So there's that, but it's also the customer wants that. But also because of fraud and security, there is a sense that there needs to be greater protection of the container, whether it's when it's taken off the vessel, whether it's on the dray, whether it's on the railroad. And so will technology of the containers help supplement that sort of security profile? And I think arguably the answer is yes. And so all of the stakeholders are part of that conversation. We actually, because of our experience with TIA and because of what you're seeing in the cargo theft space, we've started our own cargo theft working group where really we're trying to figure out what can we coalesce around as an industry before we're not seeing a whole lot of action from the federal government. There's a couple pieces of legislation, but what can we do before it sort of eviscerates various companies? There's too many companies who are suffering losses because of this.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And I think, like everything, we're asking for visibility. So I talk to people all the time about over the road transportation, and they'll say, "We'll give you end to end visibility." And what they mean is from the time they pick it up in Indiana to the time they drop it off in Philadelphia. I was like, that's great, but that is not end to end for the supply chain. End to end for the supply chain, it might have started in China or Vietnam or India. And so that container, we want visibility and we want the security every step of the way. And I think we all have recognized, obviously, securities can mean a lot of different things. I don't want it stolen, but I also don't want the wrong stuff being shipped to this country because they can't check every one of those containers. And so there's an enormous effort at the ports to try and make sure we don't have anything bad coming to this country. And when I say bad, I don't mean just bombs and stuff, but I just mean food that's not supposed to be here, plants that aren't supposed to be here, drugs. So there's,
Yeah, I mean that's how we have the snakehead fish. You know about the snakehead
oh,
fish?
that's a nightmare.
Right, it's a nightmare. And then kudzu, that's why we have kudzu. I mean, all of this stuff that was mistakenly sent on a container or in a in a box somewhere.
Yes, yes. So getting back to the container, the journey. So let's just say I'm ordering, say, shoes. I I'm a shoe company and my shoes are being made in China. I I send an order for manufacturing. They manufacture them. They get a container somewhere in the middle of China. It's never on the ports. It's in the middle of China. They fill that with shoes, and a trucking company pulls it to the port. It gets put on a ship. It's got to clear customs. It goes all the way over here, and then that container arrives here. It's got to clear customs, and then here that could go by dray truck to a rail and be railed across the country, especially if it was probably came to LA if it was moving from China. And then you mentioned these Class B railroads.
Class 1 and Class 2 and Class 3. So the Class 1 railroads are the big guys.
So I had it wrong there. So it's Class 1. So the Class 1s are the big ones that you see going across the country. The ones that seem like they're going nowhere or they're abandoned, those are the Class 2 and 3. And I always see those. And there's one in Ann Arbor, not too far from where I live. And I go, I just thought it was an abandoned railroad until I got into this business. And I said, oh, no.
Well, so I mean, the analogy is a regional rail is like a regional airline. You know, the Mesas of the world, and I think the other one I'm forgetting, but they're going to exploring a merger, which is fascinating. But you know, there's not enough necessarily business for the large guys to operate a huge route to say, you know, from Los Angeles to Carson City, Nevada. But a regional railroad operating under maybe the umbrella of that larger railroad, larger airline could do it. So this is sort of the same thing, which is the Class 2s and 3s. This is business that may not be big enough to sustain a Class 1 railroad, but is plenty for a Class 2 and 3. And they may receive it through interchange or what have you, but that's the purpose of it.
So that container could go all the way to by rail and go to another railhead and be moved by dray and then taken to a warehouse or picked up by a truck. Or it could go on those shorter rail, the the Class 2 or the Class 3. And those might only go 50, 100 miles, and they will support dozens of industrial locations. I never was aware of that, but it is we're talking about rail. Rail is cleaner than trucking, generally speaking. You need enormous volumes. You can't do it with, they're obviously aren't going to deliver to a house. You need big volumes, but it's cleaner and greener. So I think a lot of supply chains are looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, so the railroads used to famously say, and maybe the stat has changed, but they got 458 miles per gallon. So that is part of, sustainability is certainly part of most people's supply chains, is trying to figure out how we can make it sustainable. But really, if it's sustainable, that's great, but you really need it to be efficient. And if it's not efficient, is sustainable as it could be, you're not going to use it. And so the motivation, of course, is it is the most efficient way to get the box from the port to the end user. And so there's a lot of steps along the way, though. So it's a complicated mechanism.
Yep. So let's just say it does get by truck or by Class 2 or 3 rail to some industrial company somewhere in the U.S., the last time that those goods were touched were in China. Now, when you go before intermodal, that stuff would have been loaded and unloaded a half a dozen times. And it's funny, if you talk to your grandpa always says, "Oh, I worked at unloading boxcars." And that used to be a job. And boxcars are enormous when you walk up to them. And if you have to unload one, it's apparently a very crazy hard job. But when you're handling it, there's enormous amounts of damage and loss. There was a lot of theft back in the olden days when you unloaded, because you just say, Oh no, it got broken along the way.
Yeah, they'll never miss it.
Yeah. And so ports were notorious for theft and for damage and also tons of injuries. And by the way, if you're getting injured at work, I think you're probably feeling pretty entitled to steal the next day when you come into work. And so when we switched to intermodal, it was enormously efficient in terms of getting all that handling out, all and great, really horrible jobs in between. So, so what are some of the challenges that these companies are going through that own the intermodal business?
So part of it is what I just talked about. Cargo theft is an enormous um, thorn in everyone's side. But part of it too is just ensuring that supply chain works. And as we talked about in 21 and 22, the supply chain did not work. And part of it was because the volume of the demand was just unprecedented, right? But at the same time, we also had some real downturns in the level of service. Famously, the railroads, the class one railroads, had very bad service in 21 and 22. And then there weren't enough drivers for the motor carriers, for the dray drivers, right? There weren't enough. And so that meant that capacity was so dear. And so the prices went up. One of the things that we have advocated for as a consequence of all of this is that the independent driver, that model exist and be allowed to prosper. As you know, there are states, California namely, that is essentially trying to outlaw the independent contractor, and that really has an impact on the dray driver, mostly because those are, by and large, 80% of those folks are independent contractors.
Yeah, that was AB5, I think, is the law. And I'm not positive of this, but I think it's made it difficult to do Uber or Lyft because those were considered contractors.
Yeah, I think that was the initial motivation. And then instead, there's all these unintended consequences, you know?
Yeah, that's a truly, truly bad law. And what's happened over time is anybody who's connected gets an exception. So what was wild, I saw a video where a guy was a musician. And he says, I got this gig. I'm going to get paid like $5,000 to go play. I got a drummer and I got a guitarist. I got these guys to come on stage. I have to make them employees. They're not employees of mine, except I have to make them employees for the day because they played with me. And just a huge hassle. But those dray drivers, not only they have to be, again, they're being hassled by AB5, but I think there's another challenge, which is I think you have to have I think you have to go electric there. So there's an emission thing. And by the way, I understand everybody wanting to reduce the emissions. From what I understand, LA Long Beach has some emissions problems. It's the nature of their weather there, but not everyone's going to go buy an electric vehicle to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we all know this. The technology is not there yet. I mean, it's highly inefficient and would completely constrain the logistics industry, and as a consequence, the movement of goods in the state of California. And one just wants a recognition of that. I mean, look, we all have high, lofty goals of having a cleaner environment, and it's a worthy goal. But let's have a recognition of the pragmatic realities, and that's, I think, what is disturbing to many in the logistics space, if it's be it a railroad or a truck or what have you, is that there just seems to be an absence, devoid of recognition of the reality.
Yep. By the way, there's that, I don't know, I think a lot of warehouses, and I think they call it the Inland Empire area. As Phoenix became a freight hub just suddenly.
Yeah, well, there you know why.
Well, it's 300 miles from LA Long Beach, and the cost is much cheaper. I think it's 30% cheaper. It's a more business-friendly state. And I know I talked to the economic development people from from Arizona. They're looking at ports, I think, in Mexico that can also at some point deliver to on the West Coast, obviously, of Mexico. Now, those aren't developed ports like Long Beach or LA, but I think we'll see competition for the port business. Not that we're anytime soon going to replace LA Long Beach, but if you aren't business friendly, if you make it really hard on us, we're going to look around.
Right, right.
And that brings me to another point here. Um, we have ports all over. We have them on the West Coast. We have them on the East Coast. And I think during COVID, we all became aware that there's jam up on the on the West Coast. And some of that stuff moved to the East Coast. But I think what we've seen in the I'm going to say last 5 years, is a recognition that we can go to any port we want to. And I think the fastest growing port is Savannah or Virginia.
I
I mean,
think
those,
Savannah. I think so.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's a newer port, and I should say upgraded port. And obviously, you see a lot of business being done there. But I think New York, for the first time in like 50 or 80 years or something, was busier than Long Beach in LA a year or two ago. I don't know if we'll see that on a regular basis, but I think because they were a little easier to work with.
Yeah, it's interesting. The impact of the part of it was the negotiation of the longshoremen's contracts, which then came east, right? And there was sort of this fear of a rail strike. And so people will do whatever they can to adapt. And if it looks like they're not going to be able to get into a specific port, then they're going to find another way to get to another port. I mean, you're exactly right. This is the business we're in. We're in the logistics business. So we'll figure it out. We are not going to, cry to the heavens and say, why, God, why? We'll say, all right, what can we do instead?
Right. Well, we have, when we say Longshoremen's Union, there's two of them, one for the West Coast, one for the East Coast. And if the West Coast one is, having trouble with the shipping companies they're working with and start slowing down the business, it moves to the East Coast and vice versa. But from what I understand, they're two separate unions. And I keep thinking, I'm not a union boss, but if I was, I'd say, you guys should merge.
Yeah, I don't. That would be beneficial.
But as a business person, I was like,
Yeah.
no, please don't merge.
Would that be beneficial to them? Probably. I don't know. Maybe. I don't want to opine.
No. So anyway, I think also we've seen in recent years, we saw the drought down in Panama, and I think that's 5 or 6% of global trade goes through there every day. Then we had the Suez Canal which you got to go to the Red Sea to go to the Suez Canal. They had the Houthi rebels up there. So that's like 10, 11% of world trade. We had to go work around those. We have a war in the Middle East. We have a war in Europe. And so we saw all sorts of movement among these shipping companies and as the customers. And I don't think we would have seen that 20 years ago. This is what I think, well, it goes from here to there. It's too hard to change. Now I think the technology and the customer expectations drive us to say, oh, okay, Panama's not working? Cool, we'll do it. We'll get it to LA and ship it by rail or whatever has to happen.
I think that's exactly right. You're exactly right. Customers expect timely delivery, and they expect you to figure it out, right? It's not our problem. You figure it out. And by and large, our members have risen to the occasion. I mean, the thing we can all predict is unpredictability and uncertainty. So knowing that it's not necessarily great for business, but it is good for those folks who love logistics.
Yep. And speaking of which, so we're talking on April 8th. It's a Tuesday. And in the last week or so, we've been talking all about the Trump administration tariffs, and it's got everybody in a tizzy. And, when I was at Manifest, just when they started talking about the tariffs, and I asked a lot of people, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And I'm going to give my quick opinion here, and then I want to hear from you. I think in the long run, we're going to reposition supply chains. We're going to move a lot of stuff that has been in China, and we're going to move it back here. So we're going to see those tariffs probably stay high for China. But I think we're going to have better trade agreements with Canada and Mexico, and I'm guessing Latin America to the extent that we work with them.
Yeah, I think so. Our members are split on this. We are not all of one mind about whether the tariffs are going to benefit our businesses or not. But we are unified in the notion that businesses do not thrive in uncertainty, and one wants there to be an end game. So if the end game is we sign better deals with countries with whom we do business, then by all means, that is a benefit. But if the end game is just this is what we're going to do and this is how it's going to be, I think that is potentially debilitating for kind of future consumer demand, the destruction of demand, and what have you. Now, I am not a prognosticator. I cannot tell you what's going to happen, but one hopes that there is an understanding and appreciation that there be maybe a deal that actually works long term, that we don't just do this ad infinitum.
Yep. And yeah, I don't know the right answer either. But, I've heard different people talk about it. So there's a lot of financial people, and I mentioned this, we talked before we hit the record button, is the United States is like $9 trillion worth of debt that is coming due. So it has to be refinanced. Well, it was refinanced originally at a very low interest rate because interest rates are low then. And I think if you have a little bit of that uncertainty you discussed, if you the markets hate uncertainty, so it would maybe encourage the Fed to lower the rates. And I don't know if that's it. I've heard a lot of financial people say that might be part of this. I don't know. I'm just saying what I've heard. There's another aspect to this, which is we have done business with the global economy basically growing since World War II. And we do have some tariffs that encourage business to leave this country. And I think there's, if you look at the bottom 50% of this country hasn't done as well as the top 50%, obviously. And I think some of the thought is, could we bring some of that manufacturing home by creating tariffs that encourage supply chains to reposition? It's going to be a lot of work for the intermodal people. And you guys aren't just about international. I mean, for freight forwarding, you're also about moving containerized freight around the U.S. So it's not as if you go, oh, we're very concerned about business going
Yeah,
away.
I mean, I think just as you think through, and again, neither one of us are economists or prognosticators, but would the country accept if we do move some of the manufacturing to the United States? We pay a higher rate of pay, bar none, right? Than say the Philippines or Vietnam. I mean, an extraordinarily higher amount. And so, would our citizens then be prepared to then pay a lot more money for something they've become acclimated to spending not as much money on? And that's to me a pretty big question.
Yeah, you mentioned demand destruction. There is a thing called demand destruction, which is if that car that I wanted to get and it came from Mexico and I was going to pay 50 grand. Now I got to pay 65 grand. I'm not buying that car anymore. Like that is just the demand, the destruction of demand is a big thing. It's going to be interesting because I've always joked on my podcast that our government has a manufacturing fetish. They love the idea of manufacturing. And I think it's because they hearken back to post World War II America. 80% of the production on Earth was here. We're one of the only countries that didn't get bombed. We had a healthy economy. And so we could pay people, and there was unions, and there was nobody to compete against. There was no Korea or Japan or Europe making cars. It was just us making cars or whatever we're making. And people got paid really good money. That's the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then it changed as we went global. And I think the global economy benefited us because we all got cheap goods. But if you're a manufacturing guy in Flint or Cleveland or, so many other manufacturing hubs, life got a little harder if you didn't adjust.
Right. And we became the largest service economy as you sort of recognize. And so it's hard to unwind that. How do you go? How do you go back 50 years? And
Yeah,
so
we're not going to need the manufacturing heads. It will be automated because we don't have the heads right now. and and by the way, I always joke about it when we say, yeah, we want good manufacturing jobs, and I said, yeah, but do you want your kid to go work in that factory? I can introduce you to my kids because they aren't going in there. By the way, I had one of my daughters work in a manufacturing plant for 6 weeks, and she hated it, of course, but I always think forevermore she knows what it's like to work in a
well,
factory.
yeah, I think that's an important lesson to learn for sure. Everyone should have a job that they hate in that capacity. You learn a lot from a job that you hate.
Yes, exactly. Um, so we're going to have some big changes with the and one other thing I should mention when you hear the talk of the tariffs, you always hear this trade imbalances. We see that trade imbalances with the intermodal because the shipping containers come here full and leave here to go back to Asia empty. and most of the containers, from what I understand, are empty. Now, I think we've tried to get some things that we ship out
Yeah,
that would
we
be
show
like
ag
grain,
exports, for example, right?
right? But it's still largely goods coming here. We send out a lot of the raw materials for it to be processed elsewhere. So the containers usually have the finished goods, but now more and more some of the stuff that might have been bulk, like agriculture stuff, is going in containers. But if we had, these tariffs over the next coming decades, we would see more and more of the stuff, the trade imbalance going down. We'd see more stuff processed here. It would be interesting to see if how many containers would leave empty compared to now.
Yeah. Joe will have to get together in 5 years and figure it
Yeah,
out.
exactly.
I
Exactly.
don't know.
Exactly. So I want to talk a little bit more about what IANA does. Again, your members are the shipping companies.
Yeah, so we have the shipping companies, so the actual ships, right? Those companies. So those folks that handle 76 million loaded TEUs annually, the marine vessels. We have the motor carriers, and so we have what is it? 98 million drayage moves annually. So that's just on the intermodal side, 98 million, right? Just think about that for a second. And then we have the railroads, and that's 18 million loads moved by rail annually. Then we have some 3PLs. Those are the folks who are just focused on intermodal. So TIA represents all the 3PLs, and our 3PLs just do intermodal. And then you have suppliers, and those are the folks that lease the chassis or who have they service the containers or they make the containers, that kind of thing, or the trailers. So it's a pretty robust membership of people who care about intermodal. And one of the things, Joe, that I mentioned at the outset was that our mission is to grow the intermodal industry. So we represent about 5% of the freight marketplace. We think that number should be higher. Is it going to represent all? No, because there's a very successful over the road trucking industry. We're never going to replace that, but it certainly could be larger, where we could divert some of the truck moves to intermodal and assure the efficiencies of that.
Yeah, that's not an easy thing to do, but it's a really impactful thing to do. If you can say, "Oh, we've got 30 truckloads a week going here," and you say, "Oh, can we do that on rail and do it for less money and a cleaner move?" By the way, I joke about this when I talk about railroads. If you ever drive through Chicago, I've made that trip a million times over to Milwaukee and back. And when you're in Chicagoland, there are so many trucks. I'm like, why am I the only one not driving a truck? And I used to think, wouldn't it be great if they had their own expressway? And then you notice running adjacent to that is the rail. And you go, that is their own rail right there. And those rail cars, what are those, 300-400 cars sometimes?
I mean, all the railroads meet in Chicago, as you know. So yes, you're exactly right. And so over the road to us has an enormously vital role to play. It's just that for the longer distances and for the larger, the bulk categories, there's no replacement for railroads.
Yep. Well, and I think if we can get that to be an option, and for many times when you're talking to a freight broker or to a trucking company, they don't have that option because it is kind of a unique skill set. Some companies say, no, no, we absolutely know how to get you, on the rail, but not everybody. I would say it's a minority skill set in the brokerage and 3PL space.
Yeah, and we hope to make it bigger.
Yep. And I think when we look at this industry, it is, again, we talked about a little bit here. It is truly the backbone of not only international freight forwarding, but of our whole economy. And again, it makes things a lot easier, but we don't take full advantage of it because it is a little harder to understand who owns those containers. It's, when we call it intermodal, those we don't usually see this happening in trucking where you say, hey, take my truck with you. Go ahead and take my trailer. You're like, we do have those agreements, but those are even rare. These containers move around the world and we trust that we're going to get them back. And I joke about it. How many times do you go somewhere and you see a container and you go, was that decommissioned or just lost?
Well, now I will tell you, you're exactly right, or is somebody living in it? Because now they're turning containers into houses. But one of the things that IANA also manages is the agreement for the industry agreement that outlines the rules for the interchange of that equipment. So it's between the vessels and the intermodal trucking companies and the equipment providers, so the ocean carriers, the railroads, and the equipment leasing companies, and then the drayage carriers. There is an agreement that is essentially responsive to how that container is treated and handled and all that stuff, and who has responsibility for what. And why is that beneficial? Because first of all, you all know what the operating rules of the road are. Second of all, that means the drayage carrier doesn't have to have 30 different contracts with 30 different ocean going vessels and railroads and equipment providers. There's one model contract that everybody understands. And so we govern that process too. And so it really is beneficial because that means 95% of our equipment interchanges are managed under that agreement. And that means that there's sort of a level of understanding and certainty in the interchange of that equipment. And that means we kind of know where it is.
Right. So if somebody wants to get into this business and they say we're over the road and we want to, and by the way, a lot of these companies with your broker or carrier warehousing company, if you're looking to get into this business, it is obviously adding another service you can offer, but I think it also differentiates you in a great way. I think you want to join IANA so you can get involved with using these standardized contracts because you obviously don't. I don't think anyone's working without the IANA contract. I imagine there's some, but I doubt it's many.
I don't think it's many. I agree. It's a really small minority. Yeah, I mean, the reason why you do is because it's actually helpful. I mean, that's why you do it, right? It helps your business be more efficient.
It's the grease. I joke about it. Every time you look at a contract, I always say, every one of these clauses is in there because there was a lawsuit at some point.
Well, it's funny you say that because the every clause in this agreement, it's called the UIIA, has been agonized over by an industry committee that essentially looks at it and represents the motor carriers and the ocean going vessels, the railroads, and says, how can we make this better? How can we actually respond to what we're seeing on the ground? And so you're exactly right. Everybody has had their hands on it, and which is a good thing because we are responsive to when the markets change or when conditions change.
Yep. So you help your companies. It's not just awareness is today. We're talking about IANA, but you're promoting the industry. You want this whole industry to grow. Are the companies you're working with, how are you helping them grow?
Yeah, a couple ways. One is that we have to have a greater sense of advocacy for the industry and a greater sense of awareness. So there are two initiatives that we're in the middle of now. And I think one of the reasons why they brought me on is that we really don't have an advocacy presence of any kind. So that means we're not part of the conversation at in the halls of Congress, at the regulatory agencies. We, and this is not to be critical of what happened before me. That was just not the motivation. The motivation was really to look at the business and to ensure the business needs. It wasn't necessarily the advocacy needs. But if we aren't out there, we will be forgotten about. And, if our business is to grow, there are ways that we can have it be, promoted through, for example, There's a surface transportation reauthorization bill every 5 to 6 years. What could that bill do to promote intermodal facilities, for example? And so just looking at ways where our industry can be promoted or protected in the sense of the independent contractor, which we talked about. The other thing is, you said you had never heard of IANA until you met one of our colleagues last year.
Yeah, I met Piyush at the cybersecurity conference.
Yeah. And so I have heard that not just from you, Joe. And so part of the other big initiatives is public relations. How do we get the name out there, not of IANA necessarily, but of intermodal and why intermodal is so beneficial to your business? If they don't know about us, they're not going to use intermodal, right? I mean, we don't want to be the esoteric thing for the folks who know. We don't want to be an insider's club. We want to be in everyone's club. And so that is something that we are very, very focused on. And it takes a lot of blocking and tackling. It takes a lot of, going up and doing shoe leather on the hill and saying, you've probably never heard of us before, but here's who we are and here's why we do it. And so it's going to take a lot of work, but it's work that we have to do. And I'm excited to do it.
Yep. I think when I think of intermodal, it is a relatively new business compared to cartage and trucking. It's really started in the late 50s, 60s, and it grew, in the last 50 years. And I think we really didn't become a global economy where intermodal really, started becoming a daily part of our lives until the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. I mean, and part of this too is as lines of business have diminished. So, for example, railroads have known to be, the carriers of coal, right? Well, the amount of coal that the nation is using has gone down dramatically. I think it used to be some over half of their revenue came from coal, and now it's down to 26%. So that means that they have to rely on other businesses. And because as we said, we're a service economy, we're importing a lot of consumer goods, that means that intermodal has become a dramatically more important share of the railroad business. And so we are there to help promote it, to make sure it's efficient, and to make sure it's safe, and all of the above.
So you have two conferences coming up here. One is coming up May 5th to May 7th. So if you want to go to that one, it's tight timing. But what is that conference? Where is it? And why should people consider getting to that conference in Kansas City?
Well, one of the benefits of IANA membership is that you can engage in our committees, and these committees deal with the operations of intermodal, how it actually works. They deal with the maintenance repair, what are the issues that we need to talk about, whether it's blown tires, who has responsibility for that, or who has responsibility for chassis when they go through a toll booth, who's paying that fee, right? Like all of that stuff. So we have these committees that come together and talk about and address the issues that face them day to day, and eventually they can come up with some really good ideas that become sort of industry standards. We're sort of setting the standard for our industry. But we also have big picture discussions about, we'll have a discussion about safety and security. We'll have a discussion about what's going on in Washington. But this is really for those folks who want to engage in a deeper level on those kind of day-to-day blocking and tackling issues that affect the intermodal industry. We have a bigger, huge conference that basically everybody goes to who is in the intermodal space, who are making deals about business and trying to figure out the right vendors and all of that. And that's our expo, always in Long Beach, at least till 2031. It will be in Long Beach, September 15th through the 17th. And that's just for, if you have touch on intermodal, you need to be there, because we have everything that anyone cares about intermodal. Every person who's in intermodal, that's when you really need to be there to sort of understand what's going to come up, the future of it.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity for the over-the-road guys who say, yeah, I want to get more involved in that. You get to these conferences and say, yeah, we can do some dray. We can, and by not every container moves via chassis. Some of them go onto flatbeds, and I know a lot of them being taken to warehousing locations to get some sub-assembly or value added, or just moved back out. And I think we're seeing also is the as I mentioned, Arizona kind of growing as a new hub. Obviously, the Southwest and Phoenix is a fast growing area. I think there's just so much opportunity to start expanding your, whether it's a brokerage or a warehousing company or a trucking company, expand into something that gives you a competitive edge, because it is sometimes becomes a commodity sale and no one wants to play that game.
No, you're exactly right. And thinking, anticipating, it's really called mix, right? So not only do you have market share mix in terms of the commodities that you represent, but also sort of modal mix is how can I make sure that I am doing the best for my customers? And having that piece of it is enormously helpful.
Yep. So is it expensive to join IANA?
We have not raised dues in 34 years, so no, it is not. It is incredibly reasonable. I may change things and say we should all start raising dues next year, but for now, no.
Well, get in now.
Get it now. It is a deal. It's a steal. It's so much of a deal. It's a steal. I would highly encourage it. And so what you do is you get discounts on these conferences, but you get to be part of an industry that you can A, try to understand, B, actually have an impact on, and C, sort of talk to the folks to make your business better.
Yep. Yeah. And I think the expectation, as we've said at the beginning, the expectation is everyone wants their supply chains to get better. And I think we're going to see a lot of movement of supply chains. We're repositioning supply chains over the next few years. And I think we're at a point where if I'm talking to a logistics company, I don't expect them to say, just tell me where to pick it up and where to drop it off. I want you to come in and be consultative. I want you to be an expert. I've said this before. I've had this conversation with somebody who does hazmat. And I said, oh, tell me about your business. And they said, we pick up hazmat. We do hazmat shipping. And I said, what makes it hazmat? And they go, well, the customer calls and they said, it's hazmat. And I go, yeah, but you're the expert. What makes it hazmat? No, we're not. They say it's hazmat. We get them a hazmat truck. And it's not a horrible way to live your life, but ideally, if I was moving hazmat, I would say I want to work with Ann because she is the foremost expert on hazmat and how it needs to be disposed and how it needs to be moved. I think today's supply chains expect that level of professionalism.
I think you're right. That's why, the 3PLs that we have and value, the intermodal marketing companies, they get that because that's their business. It is their business to get that. And so I think it's important to have that recognition that you do have to be an expert in this and really love it. And fortunately, our members really do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so focused on growing it.
Yep. Well, I love what you're doing. So I'm going to try and summarize, and I'm going to get your final thoughts on the topic. So today's topic is called Beyond the Rails, the State of Intermodal, with my friend Ann Reinke. And so we talked about what is intermodal, and that's all those shipping containers that you see. Most of them come from Asia to us, and we send empty ones back. But you see them moving on rail, you see them moving on truck. It's a super, super important part of our economy. I mentioned the book, The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. Excellent book. Please listen to it. We wouldn't have the global economy we have without these boxes. They have truly revolutionized our world. And I don't think enough people in the logistics business have a full understanding of this whole world that lives around us. You see those railroads, you see them move containers, you see them sitting in parking lots. This is really, again, a backbone of our economy that is somewhat hidden. And when we talk about trucking or freight brokerage, I feel like everyone goes, oh, I know what that is. Or I know, I got a cousin in that business. Intermodal is just a sort of a undercover. And I think all this is going to change because Ann is going to make IANA a household name.
Lord willing. Lord willing.
Yep. And you have two conferences. One's coming up, Kansas City, May 5th through May 7th. And that's more of a business meeting. But the real big one is the IANA Expo in Long Beach, September 15th to September 17th. Please send me links to all the IANA stuff and a link to, I'll make sure I put a link to this book also. And final thoughts on the topic, Ann Reinke?
Final thoughts on the topic. Well, I would say this. I think we're going to go through a pretty, let's call it dynamic period for the next couple of years. And it is critical then for our association to be part of important conversations that could dramatically affect us. So we know there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. If we're just sitting back and sort of twiddling our thumbs, like hoping to ride it out, that's not good enough for our membership. We have to be in those conversations. And so you will be hearing our name a lot.
I like it. So again, I'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile, link to your website, and any of the links you and your marketing team give me, I'll put in the show notes. And Ann, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. As always, a delight.
Thank you. And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support's very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.